Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and since Bleed got kind of a bit of a change in the last big overhaul, where Perfect Agony should work a lot nicer, I wanted to give a Gladiator a shot with an Abyssus using Perfect Agony and seeing what kind of bleed deeps you can get these days with various skills. To begin with, I wanted to play Dual Strike. That was the goal for this character. Dual Strike, Crit Gladiator Bleed. Fuck. And it was supposed to be around Dual Strike, but all in all, after playing Dual Strike for like 83 levels, Puncture, Lacerate, they both seem to just achieve the exact same thing a little bit better. So it did end up being mostly Puncture or Lacerate as a character. Can't really decide between the two of those though. With these clips, you can see it's mostly Puncture single target. I'm just stabbing away at things. One good stab at the moment, and huge bleed damage comes in. This is without Crimson Dance though, so this is just a single instance of bleed, and I have not spec'd into Crimson Dance yet because not really necessary. It probably is for the end game where you have to actually stack bleeds and have the time to stack bleeds on heavier enemies. That's when you get Crimson Dance, but to begin with, for the first, I don't know, 85 levels or some shit, you really do not need to spec into Crimson Dance. You just rely on the movement of the monsters to take way more damage that way, and this is a good example of what Lacerate looks like. It is actually pretty nice in the end if you spec for Bleed. If you're not very bleed oriented, Lacerate just feels kind of slow and clumsy these days, but with a lot of bleed investment, you just got to get one application on most enemies and they will end up dying, especially in these types of Blight encounters where everything's always moving and trying to get to the goalpost. You get a bleed on them without the Crimson Dance nodes and they will be hemorrhaging big time, especially with Lacerate where you can press one button and go from your clear skill into your full single target skill. So it's actually a pretty convenient bleed applicator for sure, whereas Puncture, while still very, very good, you do have to swap around 2 gems to go into full-blown single target. For clear, it's pretty nice. It kind of plays similar to an Infernal Blow, but you could definitely imagine a world in which you have more weapon range or more area, and I've tried to get some weapon range in the build, or at least as much as I possibly can, and then a decent little bit of area, but it still isn't ever going to compete with any real clear skill, but it is respectable and does get the job done. The problem is when you want to go single target, you have to swap out Ancestral Call, you have to swap out Melee Splash, and then go full-blown single target, so you won't have your huge single target at your disposal at all times, whereas Lacerate, it's the press of one button, going from Sand Stance to Bleed Stance, and you will be full-blown single target at that point, and it is pretty convenient for a playstyle, and very competitive compared to the Puncture for bleed damage as well. Likewise, once you get to Crimson Dance stage, that's when you will probably be very heavily lacerating, because it makes a lot more sense to stack up your bleed stacks that much quicker as Lacerate. So all in all, Lacerate's probably going to be your premier bleed applicator and character for this type of shit, but Puncture has the biggest single target possible and also is kind of a novelty to play with. Ultimately, it's probably more of a bow skill, I'd say, if you're going to play around with any bleed and Puncture so that you can be ranged, and it's probably going to be less of a swap from single target to area, since you won't need to have multi-strike, since you won't need to have Melee Splash and Ancestral Call to begin with. You'll probably just have most of your setup with a bit of Pierce or something like that. So I think Bleed and Bows with Puncture could actually be pretty cool these days. For the most part, Lacerate just seems to be a much nicer build and applicator for a Gladiator with 2 swords. Built around fossil weapons. I did initially pitch a nice Blade Flurry, and it should still be very good, but you don't really focus as much on bleed as a Blade Flurry character, or a Double Strike, or all the other stuff. If you're going for the heavy bleed stuff, then Gladiator is a very good choice with the fossil weapons, and then of course using either Lacerate or Puncture. Now I do want to get into how I've built this character and what's going on, especially the numbers of the damage. So here is our Gladiator, currently level 86, called Bleeding Player Base. Pretty self-explanatory. And we've got ourselves 2 fossil-made weapons that are what look like pretty basic weapons. All you've got is essentially the same flat physical as a crafted fizz, and then just a crafted 120% or so. It does take quite a bit of work to get a decent weapon. Ideally, you can just isolate the 60% bleed modifier and then multi-mod around it, but it does end up being pretty costly just isolating and multi-modding. Normally, it'll probably run you 4 or 5 exalts to be able to do that, whereas I'm just using corroded plus jagged fossils to try and get something respectable that you then just craft 1 mod onto. We don't have any attack speed, we don't have any crit, and you can feel it a little bit, but it's not really a big deal to be missing out on those. They're largely quality of lives in this type of build. For the most part, you just kind of want a bit of extra fizz. So I did end up putting, like, I don't know, 4 exalts worth of fossils into making these, and it's the best that I could come up with in the end. After all the blood, sweat, and tears, it's definitely possible to get a lot better, especially if you just isolate the mod and multi-mod, but this is what I've got, and it definitely works to the extent that it needs to at the moment with the current bleed damage. Now I'll show you what that is, and that is currently about 900k on puncture in pure single target mode. That's if the target isn't moving. So 900,000 DPS is pretty respectable, since it is a very consistent, easily applicable amount of damage. Whereas if the target is moving, since you would have noticed in the video a little bit how huge the damage can be when things are moving, it goes all the way up to 2.7 mil. So it's pretty freaking huge if the enemy is moving. Some bosses and enemies will be doing that, some will not. So you definitely have to take that into consideration. But eventually we will probably be speccing into Crimson Dance, which cuts our damage, and you can't really currently showcase what the bleed will be. You have to times it by 8 manually, and well, yeah, it becomes pretty large bleed damage, but it's hard to get all of that completely up and reliable, because you have to factor in the 60% chance to get the 100 more thing. You have to factor in Ruthless, you have to factor in getting 8 stacks. So chances are, and critting, chances are it's going to take you like 20 plus attacks to get your real huge amount of damage up with Crimson Dance. Whereas if you just do it without Crimson Dance, you will have pretty consistent, pretty reliable damage that definitely tops out at a lower amount, but is pretty reliable for most bosses. And then plenty of bosses do move, and that gives you plenty more damage. So that's the numbers we're dealing with, and that's Puncture. Lacerate has similar numbers, just a little bit lower, and then Dual Strike is quite a bit lower, but it's still playable, and it's what I did to begin with. It's definitely the worst one of the 3, and then Lacerate, as I mentioned, is just a single button press instead of swapping around your gems. Using Ancestral Call, Melee Splash, having to swap those around is kind of annoying, but it's not that needed during most clear. It's just for the boss that you come upon, you will then need to swap around. Whereas Lacerate uses things like Multi-Strike, doesn't need Melee Splash or Ancestral Call, and then we use Chance to Bleed as well. So the current links for a Puncture build are Ancestral Call, Melee Splash, Brutality, Deadly Ailments, and Melee Fizz. And if you do Lacerate, you swap around into Multi-Strike. Now Multi-Strike does feel kind of shit until you get a fair amount of attack speed. I still don't have that much attack speed, but it's a manageable amount. Then you put Chance to Bleed over Melee Splash. So it needs quite a few levels. You do need Challenger charges. You do need your Frenzies and Blood Rage and all that going. Because if you just see we're standing here and right click a Lacerate with Multi-Strike, it takes a pretty long time to get all of your things off. Like, there you go. That's kind of slow. You do have an example in the video just a few minutes ago of me attacking at full pace, and it's pretty quick. And in that context, it really doesn't feel too bad. You've got your Protected Totem, your Blood Rage, you're getting full Challenger charges. It gets pretty fast, and like I said, I'm not very attack speed based at the moment with weapons like this. I went for the slowest, hardest hitting rapiers you can get, and that's why we're using Vile Rapiers. So it wasn't based around Lacerate at all. It's more of a Puncture or Dual Strike type setup, and that's why we're not that fast. But at this point, it is manageable, and multi-strike isn't the absolute devil with Lacerate. It does work, especially if you're using Bleed. The rest of the gear is just trying to focus on trying to maximize our damage. So we have physical damage over time Elder Gloves here with chance to bleed. I thought it'd be pretty cool to have a 5th link on Leap Slam, but it doesn't really do much. Leap Slam can clear and actually apply some bleeds and kill monsters while you're mapping, but it's kind of janky. It just doesn't have super good area, so it's not really worth trying to get chance to bleed here. The amulet here can also get physical damage over time. With some crit multi would be nice, but not that important since we have quite a lot of crit multi anyway. And then we're trying to make Abyssus a thing because perfect agony scaling isn't quite as shit as it used to be, so that's why we're rolling Abyssus here as well. Besides that, trying to get a vulnerability delve ring. They're pretty cheap to buy a decent one of. Anything with like life and resist would be good. The flat fizz hardly matters. And then a min endurance. Likewise, a min endurance on a ring with accuracy. And then just filling out some life resists, and some more accuracy there. The chest is a project of mine. It's a Elder eye level 86 base, which I like 5 exalts or something, and then I 6 linked it. And I was trying to go for the real biggest, meatiest rolls, but end up getting something like this, which has no impact on my base whatsoever. You can craft something like this on any armor base because the point of an eye level 86 astral plate is to be able to have the high crit chance roll and the T1 life. Neither of which I happen to hit here, so it's kind of wasting the base, but it is still a very nice roll. In total, I was trying to get the mana cost from serrated fossils and either a maim or a crit roll, so I was going for either one of those because they should be worth about the same to my character, and we ended up getting this one, so it's pretty decent. And all it really means is I don't have to focus that much life on the passive tree. So by level 93, if I fill out my passive tree, I will end up having about 5.6, 5.7k life. If I didn't have this great of a roll, I would have had to do something a little bit different, a little bit more life. But with all our challenger charges, with our endurance charges, outmatch and outlast, with a perma basalt flask, you can actually get pretty tanky. I rarely take that bigger hits, even with Abyssus on, and I think the life pool shouldn't be too much of an issue anyway. It's a very flexible sort of flask setup, and we're even using a mana flask to fix our mana sustain since I don't have any leech, but I don't really need anything else for flasks, and this does let you spam and fix all of your mana for any skill you're using, so it's pretty convenient. And you can see we've got a nice little Rave Saber, sort of Beat Saber setup where, you know, slashing away, looking like a real virtual reality gaming pro. Haven't quite figured out what to do with the rest of my sockets yet, or haven't cared too much. I will get around to that, but currently you can see we're using Flesh and Stone, level 1 Precision, War Banner, and the Pride Aura, which gives us quite a lot of damage. Boom. Where I can't really use a good Watcher's Eye for it. None of them apply for Bleed, I don't think, which seems kind of stupid to me, since this was introduced to help pure physical builds, which are largely bleed based, to exist, but none of the Watcher Eye mods do anything for it, so go figure. And otherwise we're using an Ancestral Protector just to attack faster, since War Chief doesn't impact your bleed damage, and that is something you can like just learn what impacts bleed damage, what doesn't, by pretty simply showing node power. You can see so many things don't add to bleed damage, they only add to total DPS. For example, increased attack physical damage, that's just a pure DPS, doesn't help you bleed. Likewise, if you look at sort by DPS on POB, things like Lion's Roar, you would have thought maybe that helps bleed damage. It does not. It only helps your initial damage. Thus why we're not using it, because I could up my actual DPS, but we're really trying to focus on pure bleed here, and that's why we're doing that. Lastly, I'll mention POB still doesn't incorporate chance to bleed fossil weapons, so I have to manually input, at least on one of my rapiers, 60% more damage with bleeding, and that does cover the DPS from having both of them on, which lets us have this number. So if you import your damage with fossilized weapons like this, you will be missing that huge multiplier, so you have to make sure to at least edit the line to check exactly what kind of damage you're dealing. That's about it all for this character, for all I'll say at the moment. Is it worth playing? Kinda. Bleed is still very fun, very satisfying, but we'll see how the endgame DPS holds up and the endgame delving. Typically, these types of Gladiator Bleed characters are very nice for deep delving. We'll have to wait and see because I am using an Abyssus, and it is a bit of a slightly weirder setup than usual for a Bleed character. If it can delve very nicely and take on endgame content, I'd say it's worth making. They're pretty damn fun. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.